Welcome everyone to our Trade Policy Forum webinar on getting started in a trade policy career. We're just going to give it a few minutes for people to come into the room and then we'll make a start.
Welcome everybody, come on in. It's career day here at the TPRF Forum. Ben has gathered some really cool people that we get to listen to today. Come on in. Hello everybody. I know some of these people. You do too, Ben. Laona is here, Nicholas is here, Soma Swati, Bisarut. Hello everybody, come on in. Hello Julia. Hello everybody, so good to see you. Come on in, come on in. A really great place to get started, I think, is to jump on the jump into the chat box and tell us where you're coming in from today, and maybe even where you are in your career a little bit, right, Ben? So we can get a feel of where we want the conversation to go here today. Because as you know, this is not a monologue, this is a conversation, and we really want you to take part of it. Hey, Ellen, Elizabeth, Irene. Hello everybody. Michael, come on in. Welcome, good to see you. We're just gonna take about one more minute, and then Ben, how about I hop on and start talking about the forum?
Sounds
right?
Good.
So,
yeah.
Okay. So welcome everybody to the TPRF Forum. Today, this is Career Day. We run these once or twice a year by popular demand. My name is Hannah Norberg, and I am the co-founder of the TPR Forum, together with Ben Shepherd. Woo, who's right there. Hello, Ben. And we started this 3 years ago to connect people, to use the analogy of the bridge there, to build a bridge between academics and practitioners, between lawyers and economists and political scientists and international relations people, between rookies and legends, and between across both generations and the big oceans of the world. So to build this global network of awesome people who are interested in trade policy. And we've been running this for pretty much 3 years now, coming up in October. And we usually run about once a month a webinar on research. And what I really love about this forum is that we have people coming in from all over the world, like today. But it's also that it's a very generous and nice place to hang out, and we run on volunteer power. So if you're seeing all the posts on LinkedIn and Twitter, you'll see that the posters are made by Rabiul in Pakistan, and we have Karen in the US and Ricardo in Japan who handle the website for us. We have an amazing team of advisors, and we have Sylvia and Jeffrey who help us also with the content here. So it's a very cooperative setting, and so we're always looking for people to help us out if there's something that you're passionate about, or if there's perhaps also a topic that you would like us to cover. But without further ado, Ben, I'm just going to hang on just 1 second. So this is a conversation, not a monologue. Very welcome, everybody, those who just slipped in right now too. So please hop on over into the chat box and get started right away. Tell us where you're coming in from today, and maybe something a little bit about your career. And I will hand it over to Ben, because he put together this amazing webinar, and he will introduce these speakers that we're so grateful to have here today.
Okay, thanks, Hannah, and thanks everyone for joining us. I'm just going to say a few words of introduction about our panel. So what we want to talk about today is getting started in a trade policy career. And so we've assembled people at different points in their careers and with different backgrounds to try and get a sense of how it's worked for different people, and also to get them to help us out with a few hints and tips for people who are just getting started or who are looking to take the next step in their career. So I'm going to go in alphabetical order. First, we've got Paul Brenton. So it's nice to have Paul back at the forum. Paul is someone I've had the pleasure of working with over a long period. He has just retired from the World Bank, where he was lead economist in the macroeconomics, trade and investment global practice. Paul has had a very varied career going across research, ranging from writing papers to policy research, also operational work. He's lived in Africa. I think it was Addis, right, Paul, that you were in for a couple of years. And he's worked extensively on Africa as well as other parts of the world. And he's been editor or co-editor of a number of important books that have come out of the bank during his time there. So, Paul, we're very happy to have you with us. Next is Barbara Ramos, who's Chief of Research and Strategies for Exports at the International Trade Center in Geneva. So prior to joining ITC, which of course is an intergovernmental organization, Barbara was team manager and knowledge lead at the Global Alliance for Trade Facilitation, which is based at the World Economic Forum, also in Geneva. So that's an interesting change in organization type that we'll probably get to talk about. She's got experience working with some of the development banks and also teaching at the Fletcher School in Boston. Nikita Singla is next on my list. So Nikita is currently working as an independent consultant. She's normally based in New Delhi in India. She actually comes from an engineering background. So one thing we'll be able to talk to her about is making the transition from that track to the economics and public policy track and how that worked out for her. So prior to going the route of being an independent consultant, Nikita was an associate director at a New Delhi-based think tank. So she can also talk to us a little bit about what it's like both to work in an environment like India, which is obviously a different one from a trade policy perspective than Geneva or Washington, and also what it's like to move from a think tank into an independent capacity. Next on my list is Anna Twum. So Anna is also someone I've had the pleasure of working with over a long period. Anna is currently an economist in the Young Professional Program at the World Bank. And before that, she was at the International Growth Center based in primarily in Rwanda. So again, she's got an interesting organizational background. A lot of people are going to have questions about the YP program at the bank, so she can talk to us a little bit about that. But it'll be great to hear about her experience at the International Growth Center as well, which I think is one of the more interesting models for the type of organization that we see working in trade policy. Then finally, we have Colette van der Ven. So Colette is an international trade lawyer specialized in trade and development, and she's the founder and director of Tulip Consulting, a Geneva-based consulting firm. As the name Tulip suggests, I believe Colette hails from the Netherlands at some point. So she'll be able to talk to us about the legal side of it and what it's like to get started in a career as a trade lawyer specifically, because there are obviously some steps that are quite different from what you would see in a more economics or public policy based background. And then, of course, how you reach the point where you're doing not just strict legal advisory work, but also mixing it with policy work. So we're looking forward to hearing about all that. So that's our panel. As Hannah said, we want this to be interactive. So I've opened up the chat in the webinar. Please feel free to type your questions and comments into the chat box, and we can recycle them into the discussion with our panel members. But what I'd like to do, just to get us started, is ask each of the panel members the same question, which is, how did you get started in trade policy? So, Paul, maybe I can start with you. What were some of the first steps that you took to get going in this career?
Thanks, Ben. Thanks very much for the opportunity to be here. I guess I'm the oldest, so maybe it's age first rather than alphabetic. But then, yeah, so back in the Neolithic period, my lucky break was getting a sponsored PhD, and it was sponsored by a transport company that was shipping goods across the North Sea from the UK to the continent, and they wanted someone to estimate export and import demand equations. So I spent my PhD, I spent 6 months collecting data, which these days you can get in 6 minutes, and estimated a lot of quite complicated demand equations, so it wasn't particularly trade policy orientated, but it was very much linked into what that company wanted. Then I had a really lucky break because my first post PhD job was working for Alan Winters, so people probably know, which you couldn't get a better apprenticeship, if you like, on how to apply rigorous empirical methods to really important trade policy issues. So that was really my grounding. I then spent about 5 years in universities, but I doing the teaching and the admin, wasn't particularly what I wanted. And so then I moved to a public policy research institute in Europe called the Centre for European Policy Studies, where, again, the aim was to sort of apply rigorous empirics, economic techniques to some of the big trade policy issues of the day. And at that time, it was the transition in Eastern Europe. So I was lucky again that I made the move when there was a big issue, and there was a lot of work on WTO accession, how to move from sort of almost autarky to a more open trade policy. So there was a lot of work at that time. So I think you're thinking of what are the big issues of the day, and trying to make sure you can, if you can, work on those is something that certainly helped me along the line. I then started moving into development and looking at the EU's relationships with developing countries and the policy framework for that. And that's eventually then what led me to the World Bank. And then 20 years at the World Bank, again, keeping sort of the focus as much as possible on rigorous techniques, empirical techniques, but to key trade policy issues for developing countries. That's my journey in a nutshell.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. We'll come back to some different aspects of that. What I'd actually like to do is switch to Anna. So I'm not going to do it strictly in alphabetical order. I'm also not doing it in age order. We're being much more subtle about this. So Anna, the reason I'm flipping to you is that you're currently at the World Bank, but your pathway into it was quite different from Paul's. So was wondering if you could tell us, both how you got your start and then how you got to where you are now.
Sure. So I definitely didn't grow up thinking I would be in trade economics or trade policy. But after undergrad, I ended up at the IMF in their research analyst program. I didn't do any trade work there, but after 2 years, I was ready to go get my master's. So I enrolled in a master's program on economics and public policy, which is the broadest thing you could study for a master's program. So I remember at the end of my 2 years, I was very conflicted about what I wanted to do because there's so many directions I could go in. And we had a development econ class. And at the end of the class, someone asked my professor, Ann Case, what is the biggest policy change that has lifted the most people out of poverty? And she paused for a while and she was like, I would probably say just trade policy, opening of trade. That's been very fundamental and transformational. And she said that in class, and I was like, oh, okay, maybe I could do some trade policy for some time, because I always see my career as a series of adventures, so I don't feel too, I guess, nervous about committing to one thing. So I was like, I could do maybe trade for like 5 or 10 years and see where it takes me. So then I Googled, trade economist jobs, and I came across the IGC, the International Growth Center, which Ben, like you said, has a very interesting model. They connect academics with policymakers, and they try and shape policy in meaningful ways based on evidence. And they had a trade economist role. So for anyone on the chat, if you're looking to jump into this space, I think the roles at the International Growth Center are quite nice. They have a good balance between policy and research work. So yeah, I ended up getting a role in the Rwanda program, and then worked as a trade economist for 4 years, and then joined the World Bank through the YP program. But in the broader macro trade and investment unit, I don't do direct trade work at the moment. I'm more on the macro fiscal side, but trade always comes up. And in the room, they turn to me and they say, you've done trade. You should tell us what AGOA is. And you should tell us what AFCFTA is all about. So it's been a wonderful, I think, experience that I've been able to bring to bear at my role at the World Bank, even if I'm a bit further away from it, but hoping to get closer to trade policy the longer I stay at the bank.
Thanks, Anna.
I'm going to jump in here a second.
Sorry.
Yeah, I was just going to say, sorry, because I'm just barging in here. So what I love here, Anna, is that you said, hey, how do I what topic makes the biggest difference? And then you went with that passion. Sorry, Ben, I just had to say that. That was a compliment that just had to come out.
I think that's a great point. No, it's really interesting for me to know what people's different motivations are and pathways for getting into trade. And I was just going to follow up on one thing. So IGC, I'm not sure how well known it is among the group that we've got here. Can you just explain the model a little bit? Because one of the things that I find really interesting about it is that, they have the kind of central hub at LSE in London. But then, you said you were working in Rwanda, and so they have all these country teams around in different countries. So can you just maybe explain for people a little bit how that works and what the attraction is for a young professional?
Yeah, of course. So it was set up, I think maybe 15 years ago by ex-World Bank staff. It's housed out of the London School of Economics and Oxford. And it has a hub spoke model. So you have the HQ in Oxford where you have economists that provide sort of regional support. And then you have country programs. And these programs are set up at the invitation of country governments. So, IGC doesn't sit down and say, we're going to go into Yemen. It's actually a very close dialogue with governments before that decision is made to locate in Yemen or Rwanda and Uganda. And I think what that does is you have a lot of buy-in from the governments for the sort of work that we do, which I would describe as it's more advisory, and it's advisory work that pulls from academia. So a lot of our, I guess we call them lead investigators or principal investigators, are from the academic field, or people like you, Ben, that have worked in a policy space for a long time and are experts. And we basically just ask governments, what keeps you up at night? It's usually the Minister of Finance. They come up with a list of 20 or 30 things, and we narrow down to what we think we are good at supporting, and we pull from our network and put a team together, usually write a policy brief or a longer paper to help inform some sort of policy decision that the government's thinking about. And yeah, they can take our advice or they can leave it. It's no strings attached. It's pro bono work. And I was very attracted by the model. I think it gave me the space to work really closely with governments. And also even at a regional level, understand trade policy in East Africa. So I don't know if that was a good explanation, but I'm happy to talk to anyone after the call about the International Growth Center. They recruit quite often and are always expanding. So I think it's a good opportunity.
Yeah, thanks. That was a great explanation, actually. And I'll just add in my 2 cents. I think one thing you're being very modest about is the degree of access that you get as part of this program. So, the work that I was involved in, that you were leading in Rwanda, you're able to meet the people who are making the decisions. And so for me, it's kind of one level further than you typically get when you're engaging. Normally you sort of, as a policy professional, you engage with technical staff, but IGC is, of course, doing that, but then they've also got one level higher than that. So it gives you a really unusual ability to glimpse the way a government and a country works. I think it's a really outstanding opportunity. Let me flip from that national experience to Nikita to talk about you and your experience. So you've been working in the trade policy space in different ways, based primarily in New Delhi. I mean, you're doing work for the World Bank and the Asian Development Bank now. Before that, you were in a think tank in Delhi. Can you tell us a little bit about, firstly, how you got started in trade policy, what drew you into it, and then secondly, what it's been like working in that space in India?
Thank you so much, Ben, and good morning, good evening, depending on what part of the world you are joining this from. It's such a pleasure to be talking about this journey that I feel, so passionate about. I'll be honest, Ben, I reached trade policy by elimination, by eliminating many other career options. And I come from a very normal conservative Indian background where, growing up, you had two options. Either you become an engineer or you become a doctor. And I chose to become an engineer. We didn't know that a third field existed. So I chose to become an engineer, and for those, I see a lot of participants are joining from India. I saw it in the chat. So I went to this, it's one of the well-reputed engineering colleges in India. I went to Indian Institute of Technology, IIT Delhi. So I spent my 4 years there, and I did not like engineering. So I was like, what's next? I don't want to do civil engineering. So I got into management consulting just because it was one of the most well-paid jobs that was offered. I got into that. And, I could really relate to when Anna was speaking, because during my management consulting role, one of my main projects was actually increasing tobacco sales in India. And I could not sleep many nights during that project. And I kept asking myself, what do I really want in life? What keeps me up? What is it that I want to achieve? How do I want to make a difference? And answer would always come that I want to do something in the social sector, because, normally you think that's the only way to make an impact. That's the only way to touch lives. So, and that's where LinkedIn played a huge role. And I have huge respect for this platform because, at that age, at the age of 22, I started reaching out to people on LinkedIn, and these were cold messages. I would, just write to them and say, hello, I'm from Delhi, and, I'm doing this, and I've been in my career for 1 year and 2 months, and I want to know what you do in your job. So, I wrote to people in the social sector, I wrote to people in economics, I wrote to people in law. And I spent a lot of time doing one-on-one meetings in person and virtual with these people to understand what does their day look like. And by the end of that process, I was not fascinated by anything. I wasn't sure what do I want to do. So I decided to leave everything and actually just become a full-time yoga trainer. And my parents were very upset that why did I go to an engineering school? Why did I do all this if I had to become a yoga trainer at the end? So I moved to South India, to Mysore, enrolled myself in a full-time residential yoga training center, and started on that training. And I realized, I love doing yoga, but I don't like teaching it. And now it's like, what do I do next? So I came back from Mysore, and that's when I got introduced to a project. So it was a consulting assignment with the World Bank, and I was lucky I got introduced to that. And this was basically a regional cooperation survey they were doing in South Asian countries. So this was basically to conduct a multi-stakeholder perception survey on regional cooperation. And I had the opportunity at that age, so early on in my career, to lead this survey in 7 South Asian countries. And that really offered me a hands-on opportunity, because I got an opportunity to travel to Pakistan, to Sri Lanka, to Nepal, to Bhutan, to Bangladesh so early on, and really get a hands-on experience of what regional cooperation meant. And one of the core aspects of regional cooperation, that you understand much later, is actually trade. But I discovered trade through these conversations with people, because when I would go to these countries, I would meet ambassadors, I would meet diplomats, I would meet World Bank economists, I would meet university professors specializing in regional cooperation or specializing in trade. And that's when I realized that's also a great way to, start making a real impact on the ground. Because when I got into this field, and so for those of you who don't know, my specialization is actually border trade and trade facilitation. So as a part of my role, I go to border areas very often, and you realize how a change in trade policy or a trade reform can actually impact the lives of so many people. So, for me, this was a great way of combining my passion to contribute on the ground to touch human lives using trade policy. So so I did this project with the World Bank. It was a 2-year assignment, loved it. I realized I did not have the right academic background to continue a career in this. So I decided to go to Sciences Po in Paris, because I spoke French and I wanted to continue, learning French further. So I went to Sciences Po Paris. I did my master's in economic policy there, and I got a full-time role with the World Bank while I was in Paris. So I moved to Washington, D.C. From there, I spent 2 years in D.C. with the MTI Macro Trade and Investment team, I think same team what Paul represents. So I worked with them for 2 years, again, working on South Asia, trade between South Asian countries. But So, while I loved my stay in DC, I think it was a great experience to actually be exposed to so many different elements of policy making at the macro level and to get that international experience, because coming from India, I did not have that experience. I wanted to continue my specialization in South Asia. And that's another sort of tip I want to share with all the listeners, that it's, think of what you want to specialize in. I mean, once something starts driving you, you start specializing in that. And for me, that was South Asia trade. And so I decided to go back to South Asia so that I could be closer to the field. And I began working very actively with the governments of India, Bangladesh, Nepal, Sri Lanka. And that's when I joined this think tank based in Delhi, because I mean, once I was back, I wanted to sort of deepen my work on the ground. So Ben, to answer your question, the second one, I think working with a think tank in India is very different from working with an international institution or a multilateral institute anywhere else in the world. I mean, by that time, I had lived in 5 different countries. I had done a fellowship in Azerbaijan under the president. I had worked in Sri Lanka with Agence Française de Développement, AFD. I had spent 2 years with the World Bank in Washington, D.C. I had spent 2 years in France at Sciences Po, but I was also doing assignments with different professors there. So when I got back to India, it was, both good and bad parts, because one, you get a shock when you see the differences in, the way this whole policy ecosystem works. But at the same time, I would say the much bigger part was that it was a very rewarding experience to work so closely with the government, because in the developing countries, there is this real scope of making a change, because you do something, you actually help the government implement that, and then you see the impact. So year on year, I could see whatever I was suggesting or whatever reform areas we were working on with the government, I could see that getting implemented on the ground. And that, again, touching lives of so many people. You go back to a port and a truck driver comes to you and say, oh, what you recommended in your last trip has been done, and that has changed our lives so much, that has made it easy for us. For me, that helps me sleep better at night. I feel I'm doing something good. And for me, in one line, that's my driving force to continue working in this space. And after 5 years with the think tank, I decided to go independent 2 months back, which is just, again, a testimony to the fact that trade policy is a real career. There's just so much work to do in this domain that, you could be wearing any hat and you can still do it. And so many times, my parents actually still find it very hard to explain it to anybody, what do I do? Because when my extended family asks, what does their daughter do? And they sort of still struggle to frame an answer. But for me, I would say when I'm on the field, when I'm working on this, sometimes I just ask myself, oh gosh, I'm just so lucky that someone is paying me to do this, because I would have done this anyway. That's how much I love my job. Let me stop here.
That's a great message. Yeah, I think if you can wake up in the morning and say that I would do this even if they didn't pay me, then you've definitely made the right choice. So that was a really interesting, summary of your path, and I hear a little echo of what Anna was saying about her work at IGC, that you really get this close contact with work on the ground, and I think impact is something that we all ask ourselves about as we do this kind of work. So as a policy specialist, as a researcher, what sort of impact do I have? And one thing that I hear from both of you is that working in country gives you a very different perspective on that than working outside the country. So I think that's a really important thing to take away. Let me flip now to Colette. Hannah has a question. Yeah, shoot.
Well, it's a compliment again, and that just had to come out, because what Nikita has done here is something that is so unusual. It's completely obvious to her, but not to everybody else. She is fearless. She's like reaching out, cold calling people on LinkedIn. She gives up her career and finds it again. And I just want to take that moment to let everybody have that sink in, that it's all right to say this is wrong and start over. And it's okay to cold call people at any time. That's how we got started, Ben, right? That I promised that I would cold call anyone at any time and ask for a favor. And most people, if you are friendly and supportive and you reach out in a nice way, people might not always answer you, but surprisingly enough, they do, right, Nikita? Surprisingly amount of people do take that opportunity to spend 15 minutes and give you their wisdom, right?
I just want to add that I know Ben for about 10 years now, and that's how I know Ben, because I had sent a LinkedIn message to him.
Yes, yes, that's so cool.
Had many other common connections, but that's how we got started.
That's so cool. So kudos to
we
that.
actually discovered that we have a bunch of common connections, that not the least of which is the same alma mater. So I did my PhD at Sciences Po. So yeah, no, I think it's nice when you go through this process, you often figure out what you've got in common with people as you go through it. So I think that is indeed a really good takeaway. Colette, I was going to flip to you, if that's okay, because we've been talking kind of policy from an economic standpoint and how people get into, you know, that side of the house. But I know that we've got a bunch of people online who are coming from a legal perspective. So I was wondering if you could tell us a bit about how you got into this, because I know for lawyers, obviously, there are particular steps that you need to take professionally as you're getting started. So just to get a sense of how that all fits together with working in trade policy, and then, of course, your decision to go independent, you know, where that came from and how that's worked for you.
Yeah, thank you so much, Ben, and great to also listen to all the fellow panelists. I feel like, you know, I'm just enjoying so much hearing everyone's career paths and really finding it very inspiring. So, yeah, so in my case, actually, also never had a desire to be a trade lawyer. Didn't really even know what trade was, to be honest, for a very long time in my life. But I was more into the human rights field, and I was in Cambodia to work for the Khmer Rouge Tribunal. This was set up to basically prosecute the surviving Pol Pot leaders. And I had moved there, and I was working with victims because I was believing in, you know, making a difference to human rights, and human rights law was potentially an area that I could see myself going into. And when I was there that year in Cambodia, I got involved with some opposition politics, and that got me to being involved with a labor union. And I met these, you know, women 18, 19, 20, even younger, that are the ones that go to the factory every day and they stitch the clothes that we wear. And I became friends with some of them. And what I found remarkable was that they had, in the eyes of the society, basically won the lottery of globalization, because they were employed in a proper job with a monthly salary, and it came with a handful of you know, benefits of some sort. But these people were still living in extremely poor conditions. So, you know, there was that disconnect between the narrative, globalization, what it brings, and then the reality. And I felt I had to get deeper into that. On the one hand, what the role could be of trade and trade policy frameworks in attracting foreign direct investment, in that case, where then, you know, these ladies were employed in Cambodia. And on the other hand, what the pitfalls were of that framework, such that would explain the fact that those that are gaining the ticket of globalization are still living in abject poverty and do not make more than 100 a month. So for me, that was a conundrum that I wanted to further explore. And I thought studying trade and studying laws would allow me to understand the roles of international treaties in, you know, guiding the society in one way or another. So I went to law school. I did a joint degree from Harvard Law School and the Kennedy School of Government, because I also wanted to keep the conversation going that was focused on policy. I never wanted to be in a law firm ever. That was also written by my recommenders in their letters for law school. For me, law school was a means to an end, and I was going to do development work and policy work and potentially trade work. So I took all the international law, trades, everything classes I could take. I did not even take constitutional law. You know, I really went on and took everything that the curriculum allowed me to take that was international. And the reality hit me at the end of those 4 years, which is that it's expensive. So here I was graduating, and I had an enormous debt and a passion, but that also had to be taken care of. So basically, then I became very pragmatic, and I said, well, I still want to do, well, in that case, trade. My human rights interest had shifted to trade. I want to do something on trade. I want to find a way to make trade treaties work for development and how to optimize that. But as a first step, I really have to, one, learn about these rules, because I can have an education, but I may not have the skill sets or the experience to actually work in these areas. And on the other hand, I need to be realistic and make some money. So I joined a law firm. My entire friend group / professional network was extremely unhappy with that decision. But I told them it's going to be temporary. So I joined Sidley Austin. I was initially hired in their Washington, D.C. office. They have a really good trade and investment practice. So I thought at least that way I stay close to what I'm interested in. And I asked them if I could move to Geneva because I was in Washington at the time. So I made the transition here in Geneva. Of course, we have the World Trade Organization. So I spent a couple of years litigating, doing WTO litigation, if you will, really learning the rules of the WTO rulebook and representing governments that are suing or are being sued in the context of the dispute settlement framework at the WTO. And I did that for 3 years and took care of my loans and everything and told myself, well, 3 years in, check in with yourself, because people say once you're out into that world, you're never going to come back. And I have to say, for those of you on the chat that want to pursue something, a path like that, it is really difficult. It is really difficult once you are in a path like that, like a private law firm setting, to say, actually, I don't want this. This is not working for me, and to shift gears. But if you're passionate about what you want and you build in the parameters in your day-to-day life that you're reminded of that, you can do it. So in my case, the reason I ended up going independent was because for me, the law firm wasn't aligned with my passion. The law firm was representing those that could pay to either argue the way or another country was not consistent with the WTO framework. I wanted to use the treaty as a lever to sustainable development, not as the object in and of itself. Compliance shouldn't be the end goal in my eyes. And I looked around in Geneva to see if there was a place where they did that, and I couldn't find one where, as a legal background or as a legal professional, you could actually work in a slightly different way. So that's why I developed a Tulip, and Tulip is it's a consulting firm, but it could also be a think tank. It's a little bit at the intersection of a lot of different things. Most of my work is not legal advice. By and large, most of what Tulip does is policy analysis. So we use legal frameworks, we analyze them, but ultimately it's about, can we push the envelope and can we think through innovative ways, through technical research on how we can move the needle a little bit so that the trade framework can actually serve a development objective, sustainability goals, environmental objectives, etc. So that's the gist of it, and I'll stop here. Thank you.
Thanks, Colette. That's great. It's really interesting to hear about the passion that you bring to it. And I think you've described something, something I'm getting from most of the panel is that there are changes of one type or another involved as we go through this. It's true for me too. And so I think having the drive to check in with yourself every few years and say, is this working for me or is it not? And then making a change if you need to is a really, really important takeaway. So thank you very much for sharing that. Let me move to Barbara. Barbara, you've got such an interesting background. You trained in Brazil, I think, originally, if I'm not mistaken. You've taught, you've worked at the World Economic Forum, and now you're at ITC. So what was it about trade policy that caught you?
Well, thanks, Ben, for the invitation, and Hannah as well. So I guess to answer that question, I'll pick on Hannah's question on the chat, right? Was it passion that led you to do this? And yes, it was passion, but passion comes from exposure, right? And exposure comes from luck a little bit. If you're not exposed to the right people and to the right environments, I guess that passion doesn't develop. And throughout my career, I was very lucky that I was exposed to people that took an interest in my career and became true mentors. I think Nikita was talking about reaching out to people. Unfortunately, when I was starting, there was no LinkedIn, there was no cell phones, but I had a lot of people that crossed my path and sort of gave me a lot of critical advice. And I think if there's one thing that I could tell those that are participating today is try and identify people that you admire, those that are doing cool things and things that you would see yourself doing, and try and get close to them and understand how they got to where they are. And for me, that was critical. I think from my first trade professor, that sort of opened my eyes to what trade policy could be. and trained me a lot in the right tools. And then at some point said, okay, you got the tools, go try them in the real world. Don't stay here. And then you go to the real world and have a wonderful boss that says, you know, you're doing a great job, but now you need new tools, go back to school. So you go back to school and you kind of, you know, bounce in and off, you know, and you go into academia and you come back into the real world. For me, that was really important. I feel having that mix of academic training and field experience, not just policy practice, but field experience, as some have mentioned, sort of working in the countries, in the day-to-day, sort of being there at the border crossing, as I think was Nikita was saying, spent a lot of time there. So trying to really see how the tools you've acquired and sort of this sanitized academic space will live up to the realities of trade. That to me was very important. So what I would say that drove my passion was this exposure, and the exposure came from very inspirational people that I'm very thankful for, that put me on the right track, and trying different things, sort of trying to see if the tools that I acquired would work, and then realizing that I needed more tools and going back to school, and then getting out of school and trying it again. And I think that led me to the job that I do today. That's very much applied research, even though I am at a UN organization. What we do here is sort of applied policy relevant research that tries to improve the way in which we do trade-related technical assistance. And that is where sort of my niche passion, right? It was not just trade policy, it's really trade-related technical assistance and trying to improve the efficiency and the effectiveness of the interventions that we have here at ITC. So I'll stop here.
That's great, Barbara. There's so much in what you've said that really resonates for me personally. So this balance that we're all trying to strike between kind of, you know, the more research academic side of things, then getting exposed to, you know, the real world, as you put it, actually being at a port or a border crossing or whatever, you know, that's one tension that I think all of us in trade policy have. Then the other thing that you mentioned that really struck home for me is that we're in a very rapidly changing field. So we have to be learning all the time. I'm sure this is just as true for the lawyers as it is for the economists, that there's a lot going on that we have to keep track of. And so this constant idea that, you know, just because I learned something in grad school doesn't mean I can apply it 10 years later. I've actually got to refresh myself every time I do something. For me, it's very stimulating. That's a great thing that I love about my job, that I'm constantly learning, but it also brings a certain amount of pressure with it to try and keep up to date. So I think that's all really good stuff to get out. Barbara, maybe if I can flip back to you just to change the discussion slightly. You know, the flip side of what we've just talked about is how other people get their starts. So when you're recruiting at the International Trade Centre, what are sort of 3 tips, you know, 2 or 3 tips that you would give people to try and make themselves competitive in that kind of market?
I mean, it's interesting because we're all biased, right? We tend to look at our own experiences and say, if it worked for me, it might work for others. So, you know, this might be very biased, but I think what I would be looking for if I'm recruiting, and bearing in mind where I sit at ITC, at a research unit, I would be looking for somebody with this mix of academic training, but also field experience. And when I say field experience, it's not just, you know, oh yes, I've worked after my master's degree, or I've worked after my PhD in Washington, DC or Geneva. That's very nice. I'm not saying that that's bad. I do that. I sit in Geneva, I sit at, you know, in Washington, DC. But I think particularly for those that are starting their career, as some have mentioned, being in a developing country. I mean, I come from a developing country. I worked a lot in my own country, and then I moved to other places. I think that's that gives you a perspective that no book and no headquarters sort of job will give you. So that's something that I would value. And this mix of academic and field work, I think the proportions would slightly change depending on the post to which you are applying, but I think they would still be valid. You know, if I'm recruiting for my research team, for instance, sort of the academic experience or the academic training might have greater weight at this point. But if I'm recruiting for sort of a project-based position, perhaps the field experience would be more important. But I think those two things would be relevant for me. So I guess that's not the top three, but it would be, yes, get your training, yes, get your exposure to the field. Yeah, I'll stop at 2. I think that's already enough. And then contact a lot of people, because it's at the end of the day, it's a numbers game. I know it's incredibly defeating to receive that rejection email that says, we found somebody that's better qualified. You're like, but how? I checked all the boxes. This is a perfect position for me. It's a numbers game. So reach out to people, do your networking, and eventually it's gonna happen.
Yeah, I think that's really great advice, and it's advice I often give people as well, about thinking of it as a numbers game. It's hard not to take it personally when things don't work out, but often it's not. The market is very competitive, so if I can chip in, my little bit of experience, I think for every job that we see going in international trade, it's not like there's only one person who fits the bill. We're seeing lots of people, and I think more and more people are being trained in things like international economic policy, international trade law, international economics. And so the marketplace is just extremely competitive. So you're absolutely right that it's a numbers game. And I think that advice to get the right balance between training and practice is a really good piece of advice. Paul, let me flip it to you. You were involved in recruiting, I'm sure, when you were at the bank, everything from consultants through to staff positions. And if I can say something that I think everyone who's worked with you knows, you were also a fantastic mentor for junior staff during your time at the bank. So what would your tips be? I mean, when you were mentoring people, what would you tell them are the things that they can focus on to try and give themselves the best shot of making it through this really competitive marketplace?
Thanks, Ben. Maybe just a few comments and suggestions that have come up in the discussion. I think very important that you learn from others when you're on your career path, but it's not just about sort of economics, it's also communication. And I think I learned a lot from people who weren't economists, but they were great communicators. And if you really want to influence public policy and you want to be able to translate your economic analysis and your empirics into messages that have an impact, you have to be able to communicate. So I think that's something, when we were looking for people, it's the technical skills are very important, but also the ability of how you translate those into your policy messages and how you communicate, I think is crucial. So I think that would be sort of one message there. It's your communication skills, I think, are very important in trade policy. I think just picking up on a couple of points, trade policy is very multifaceted. So I think when we were looking for people, we're not necessarily looking for people who were trade economists and have been trade economists all their life. A good economist can do trade. And so I think some people, they've had a career shift, but what we were looking for is someone who has good economic reasoning, and you can apply that to trade. So if people are listening and they haven't done any trade policy yet, that doesn't necessarily mean you can't move into trade policy field. But from our point of view, if you're a good economist and you were able to reason things through, that was a key element of what we were looking for. Again, I think, as I said, there's many aspects of trade policy these days, going from sort of globalization and foreign direct investment right down to the very specific border issues. So I think if you can show an awareness, I think, of the nature of trade issues, these are all issues that governments are having to deal with at the same time. And as you said, there's more issues coming along: trade and climate change, the trade and gender issues. These are all sort of relatively new things, but they're things that governments need advice. So, like you say, being able to, on the one hand, specialize and be very specific in the way that you provide guidance on a particular issue, but also being aware of the very wide scope of trade policy these days. And then I think, again, so I think sort of looking at technical ability would be what we looked at first. then looking at the application, how you'd applied that, and therefore your experience in the field became an important issue, and that would be the next stage of sort of distinguishing people, those who'd had the wider experience, and particularly where we were concerned in low-income countries. Some of the trade policy issues and the challenges are really quite different for low-income countries than they are for middle-income and higher income countries. So being able to sort of ascertain the different challenges for different income groups, I think was also very important. So yeah, I think let me leave it there. Those are sort of things that we were thinking about. Thanks.
Yeah, thanks, Paul. That's really useful. I think this tension that you're bringing out between being specialized enough to have impact in a really well-defined area, but also knowing the context. My impression, and tell me if you've got a different one, but at least over the length of time that I've been doing this, I think that's become more and more important. So when I write things now, it's much more common for someone to ask me a very specific question, but then want it in the context of, as you said, trade and climate, trade and jobs in particular, these sorts of things. So I think that's a really good piece of advice. Hannah, shall I throw over to you? Do you want to jump into the conversation?
I am in awe. I've never seen a conversation like this. I've never seen a panel of 100% committed, passionate, driven, ambitious, global changers who just jump in. I have to congratulate you, Ben. Oh my God, absolutely. This blows me away, and it makes me so hopeful. And it makes me feel, somebody was asking about being crazy. This actually makes me feel a little less crazy that we started this, and for all the crazy things that we're driving. If I mean, we're tight on time, but I would love to throw out the question: what is the most important thing that you could, if you have like, what is the most important thing that you would have told yourself, or would ask, or would tell somebody else? Like, what's a North Star? When do you give up? When do you not give up? Whatever. What is the thing that you just know from all this experience? Because you really are trailblazers, all of these people, and it's amazing to have you all on one call. What is the one thing that you know is true? But Ben, again, I don't want to take up the time here, so I would also leave it up to everyone else here.
Well, maybe what we can do is have people answer that along with, there's a couple of questions in the chat. Maybe I can put this one to Barbara, since I think it meshes with something that she was saying. So we've had a question about, what it's like to go through a recruitment process when you're from a lower middle income country. How do you bridge the gap in terms of sort of the level of experience that people can get in that kind of environment, the level of the type and quantity of academic training they're being exposed to, and then of course giving proper weight to the fact that they've lived a lot of the issues that we think are important. They've got this real world experience. So when you're recruiting, how do you balance those sorts of things? And I guess in a UN organization, of course, there is a mandate to be balanced in terms of geographical coverage within the unit. So how does all that work out in a concrete sense from the perspective of someone applying for a job from a lower middle income country?
So I'm happy we have a disclaimer on the first slide that you showed, Ben, and yes. So recruitment at the UN follows certain criteria, and one of the criterion is geographical sort of distribution of staff. So that plays a role. Now, my experience here has been that often that plays a role at later stages of the recruitment process. So we don't necessarily use that as a sort of as a first cut. What happens is often when you get into the later stages, you fall into the when equally qualified, you give a preference to. Now, the trick is it's sometimes hard to be objective on the when equally qualified, because as you said, and what I said in my previous answer as well, sort of the mix of your experience and your training might vary, right? So I might have somebody that has received incredibly strong academic training, but has had very little exposure to the real issues that we're trying to tackle, versus somebody that perhaps did not go through that full academic training, but has had a lot more exposure. And I think there it would really depend on the type of post that you are applying to. So yes, Paul mentioned, if I'm looking for a more research-oriented position, then sort of the training would have a heavier weight. If not, then I would tend to look more favorably at somebody with more field experience. And then again, if you're getting to that stage and there are multiple candidates, as per UN rules, we would tend to look at underrepresented nationalities. But just to link to Hannah's question, and what I would tell myself, and I know there are a few people in the call that I've had said this to. I think Lucas and Ellie, some of them have heard me saying this, and bear in mind that this is getting started in your career. What I would have wanted to tell myself when I was starting my career is it's okay not to have all the answers, and to try things and to say, actually, this doesn't work for me, and try something else. At this point in your career, you're at experimentation stage. I would actually be skeptical of somebody that says, I've started and that's it, and I've been doing this for 30 years and I'm 45. I'm like, so give yourself the opportunity to make mistakes and try different things and just see how it goes. I think, at this point, accumulate experiences, you will make better decisions later on.
That's a fantastic piece of advice. Yeah, I think as we've said a couple of times through the call, it sounds like most of us have gone through that experience of sort of trying something, going a certain way down the path, making a change, trying something else. So I think that's really good advice to try things. Since you were kind enough to talk about a recruitment process, I'm just going to put formally on the recording that everyone is speaking in a personal capacity. So that was your personal opinion. It's not the official view of the UN or ITC or anyone else. It's on the first slide in case anyone was looking for that. I think we've got time for one more question. I'm going to actually give Anna the last word, because you mentioned that at the moment you're doing a fair bit of macro type stuff, but people are constantly asking you trade-related questions. So a question that's come up in the chat, and I think you're well placed at the bank to give a perspective on this, is, what are the prospects for talking more about trade policy in the context of the general development discussion that we're having at the moment? So where is trade policy sitting for people? For instance, now at the bank, we're talking about green, inclusive and resilient growth. We have the president talking about eliminating poverty on a livable planet, putting those two things firmly together. So for you, again, your personal view, this is not the World Bank's view, it's just your personal view. How does it feel to be sitting where you sit, and how do you get to integrate trade policy into these sorts of discussions?
Yeah, Paul can jump in since he didn't leave too long ago, but I always feel like trade is under-discussed. Maybe it's my bias. Maybe I want to have more conversations around trade, but it tends to be on the periphery. I think a lot of people think they get it, right? It's trade, okay, that's it. What else is there to it? But I think it's more complicated and needs to feature more prominently in discussions around climate change. And Paul wrote a wonderful report last year on that very topic. And I think it was a seminal piece of work in integrating trade policy in the climate change discussion. So I don't think there's enough of it. I think it always comes as an afterthought sometimes in sort of the broader work at the bank. But again, this is my bias for wanting it to be discussed more. But the trade team here is fantastic, and I think they do a lot in shaping these conversations on a global level. But yeah.
I think that's a great note to end on. I mean, of course, we're all biased about trade policy. We wish there could be more discussion of it. I think just to round out what you've said, I think we've seen today, and we see it more generally in the discussion, that there is a great sort of global exchange of views going on among trade policy experts. Our little contribution is to do things like we've done today, to try and bring people together from different parts of the discipline, different geographical locations and different organisations. And we hope that for those in the audience, you've been able to take away some tips for how you can get started in this sort of career. And for me, a couple of the takeaways, actually, I think the key thing that I would take away is it doesn't matter if you don't know at day one exactly what you want to do 10 or 15 years later. I don't think any of us really knew that when we were getting started. No one's career is in fact that linear, even if it looks like it's linear. So give yourself the time and the space to make mistakes and to learn. I think that's a really nice takeaway. Speaking of learning, let me thank everyone for being with us today. It's been a really useful hour. As Hannah said, a fantastic panel. I really appreciate everything that everyone's put into it. We will be back next month on the 26th of October for a session on strategic trade policy in the 21st century. We'll have Simon Evenett from the Global Trade Alert and University of St. Gallen, and we'll have Patrick Tingvald from the Swedish Board of Trade to talk about that. Keep an eye on your email. There will be a follow-up email for those who signed up for the webinar, giving you sign-up details for the next one. Otherwise, you can follow us on LinkedIn, you can follow us on Twitter, and you can sign up for our mailing list to keep abreast of what we're doing. So again, thanks to Hannah, my partner in crime, and thanks to a really great set of panelists today. We really appreciate your time, and we hope to see everyone again in a month's time.
The most inspirational hour in my professional life in a very, very long time. Goosebumps, and I'm so super grateful to all of you here. And congratulations, Ben, because this was amazing. Thank you, everybody.
Thanks, everyone.
Bye.